How come my company never asked me?
My idea of financial security.
Country Financial does. Your country representative can help protect what you have now and prepare for the future.
Yeah.
What's your idea of financial security?
Hello and welcome to a special veto session edition of Illinois Lawmakers. I'm Jak Tichenor. Alongside is Rich Miller, publisher and editor of the Capitol Facts newsletter. Good to have you on the program, sir.
It's good to be here.
As we go into the second week of the veto session here in December, what is the mood of the place? The Capitol is in transition, especially on the second floor where the governor's office is located.
I think there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of fear. I think people on both sides of the aisle have hopes for this new governor-elect, that he can come in and actually get some things done and maybe manage the place a lot more effectively than the outgoing governor had done. I think there's a lot of fear for various different reasons. Republican legislators are now going to have to actually vote for things where they didn't vote for things before. And so there's some fear about that and what they're going to be asked to do. Democrats are wondering what pet programs of theirs will get slashed or eliminated or not properly funded or what have you. I think it's anticipation, and I don't think it's all bad either. I think on balance, I think people are more hopeful than fearful.
The governor-elect has been spending some time here at the Capitol during the veto session. He's talking to reporters, he's talking to members, he's getting his transition team up and running. They're making calls, they're vetting resumes. So he's on the ground. He's taking charge early.
Yeah, as of last Tuesday, he had already met with 30 Democratic legislators, which is pretty darn good. And he had called or reached out to a total of 150, I think, out of 177. So, he is making an effort to try to get to know people. He's making an effort to try to understand the process, which is boring to most people at home and everybody outside this building, but it's very important inside this building.
He did say during a media availability earlier today at the Capitol that it was a bipartisan mess that got us into this situation. It's going to be a bipartisan solution to get us out of it.
Yeah, and I like that sort of talk because it truly wasn't just one party that drove Illinois into the ditch over the last 30 years. I mean, this has been a bipartisan train wreck, although the Democrats have owned it for 12 years.
At this point, the 5% income tax rate sunsets on December 31st. January 1 goes back to 3.75%. You got a $2 billion hole in this year's budget.
At least. If these agencies have been spending money like they're not going to run out, okay, that hole is going to be much bigger. You see what I'm saying? If they didn't hold stuff back and they spent it, and we don't really know what has happened so far.
Well, in a briefing message from the head of the Illinois Board of Higher Education a few days ago, they said the Rauner administration told them to, go through the exercise, look at what your budget's going to be. You may have to take 5%, 10% back this fiscal year. If we don't find new revenue, it may be 20% in 2016 or 30% total.
Or 30%. Yeah. And Voices for Illinois Children released a report recently which said that if the pension reform law is struck down by the Supreme Court and if the tax increase rolls back as scheduled, you're looking at a 33% cut to discretionary funding. And they described that the discretionary funding was a really broad term. 33%. That's pretty major.
That is motivation for a lot of people to start having for the first time in many years, some serious discussions about the budget?
For the first time, yeah. And maybe think about things for the long term. And this tax increase was thrown together in a couple of days, right? And they didn't think things through. They didn't gradually step it down, which is what Rauner is talking about now, which is actually a fairly decent idea if you want to step it down. This big fall was stupid.
So you're going to put a budget together in time to meet that February deadline for the budget address?
He has some really good people advising him on the budget. Solid people.
He took one of the top Senate Republican budget people.
Correct, and he's taken some House people. He's taken some former Edgar people. he really has surrounded himself with some folks that are very knowledgeable about the state budgeting process.
Rich Miller, thanks very much as always. It's good to have your insights on Illinois lawmakers. Next up on the program, a pair of veteran members of the Illinois House of Representatives. On this edition of Illinois Lawmakers, a conversation with a pair of House veterans here in the Illinois House of Representatives. Democratic State Representative Will Davis of Homewood is chairman of the House Secondary and Elementary and Secondary Education Appropriations Committee and chairman of the Committee on Health and Healthcare Disparities. Representative David Leitch is a longtime member of the General Assembly, and he is a deputy Republican leader. He's from Peoria. Gentlemen, both good to have you both here on the program. As we go into veto sessions many times, there's always a lot of buildup, particularly in the press, about the big things that may happen. And as we look around, it's quiet right now when we're talking, and it's kind of turned out to be kind of a quiet veto session here in Springfield. What's the mood of the place, Representative Davis?
Well, I would say the mood is optimism. Obviously, there are still a number of things that we could address during veto session. Who knows, they may still come up, but since we're in the second week of veto, I don't know if there's an opportunity at any lame duck session just because of the timing of it. So I would imagine there probably won't be much activity during the veto session, but still a lot of good issues out there, a lot of great things that we could do. So again, I'm always optimistic about our possibilities.
Representative Leitch, you're reading on things?
I don't think it is quiet. I think eliminating the statute of repose is another dagger in the heart of the business community in Illinois. That was moved yesterday, and we'll see it today or tomorrow. I think the election legislation that was passed in committee yesterday will be a train wreck for fairness in elections. I think the state exchange is going to be a big problem for Illinois. That's related to Obamacare and to getting the federal money, but it also eliminates one of the best programs we've ever had in Illinois, and that was the iChip program. So I'm very concerned about what's happening now in this veto session, and I'm very concerned about it.
So let's dig into those a little bit more deeply, one at a time. The statute of repose has to do with how long you can go after pursue a particular kind of lawsuit, right?
Right. It is sort of a statute of limitations that's right now 10 years to pursue contractors who have built buildings and who have subsequently had pollutants that would cause cancer.
Like asbestos and things like
asbestos. But it opens up not only those contractors, but architects, the subcontractors, the whole ball of wax. It's a huge gift to the trial lawyers.
Representative Davis, this is something that Speaker Madigan has been pursuing, correct?
It is, and I don't know if I would agree with everything there. I mean, we've seen a number of cases, even going to military personnel that have been affected by certain agents, and we give them the opportunity to go back and seek redress. It's our understanding scientifically that some of these issues don't manifest themselves until long after a 10-year period. So if there's an opportunity, even after a 10-year statute of limitations, to go back and to seek a remedy for something, I think you think you'd want to give people the opportunity to do so. But you know, if we have faith in the legal process, we think that the legal process will bear itself out.
When it comes to the elections law, this is partly making some of the changes that were in law during this current or this last election. Is it basically codifying and making those permanent? Would that be your reading on it?
Well, I mean, clearly, you know, the changes that were made were beneficial to my colleague on his side of the aisle. Obviously, we have a Republican governor, but I think any opportunity to give individuals an opportunity to vote, to register to vote, why would we stifle those opportunities? I mean, that's what we should be doing, is creating broader opportunities for individuals to vote.
Representative Leitch?
I think it's a recipe for election fraud. I think that the same-day voting and the changes that are implemented in this legislation are very, very seriously threatening the legitimacy of the election process.
In terms of the healthcare exchanges, basically what they're trying to do here is now make an Illinois health care exchange so that if, for example, the Supreme Court rules against the federal exchanges, which Illinois is currently using, then the 200,000 or so people would still have an opportunity for health care under the Affordable Care Act. Is that right?
Well, yeah, and again, why are we talking about limiting someone's opportunity at health care? There's federal money on the table. Illinois is going to be faced with some serious budgetary challenges based on revenue. So if there's an opportunity to acquire even more money at the federal level, but yet at the same time provide a needed service to individuals by giving them access to health care, setting them up with primary care physicians so they won't spend their time in the emergency rooms where it's costing us even more money to pay for their health care, then why not try to pursue these opportunities?
Representative Leitch, you
Well,
like that idea?
other states that have set up exchanges have found it to be more expensive to pursue the federal money, and they're trying to get rid of the exchanges. And so there are a whole litany of reasons why these exchanges should be worrisome to Illinois and to the financial position of Illinois. We've heard the arguments in favor of it, but on closer examination, those arguments do not hold water.
An issue that also may find its way to the floor is trying to raise the minimum wage in the state of Illinois. And there's an interesting kind of give and take going back between the Springfield and the city of Chicago, where Mayor Emanuel is trying to raise that up to $13. Down here, House Democrats and Senate Democrats are talking about a $10 or so raise. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that's correct. And obviously there's kind of that give and take. I support raising the minimum wage. I think that when we give people more money, they will spend more money, and that means more revenue to the state through sales taxes and other things. So I don't think there's anything wrong with raising the minimum wage, particularly when we have data that shows that people currently on the minimum wage are living at or below poverty. Why are we continuing to keep people at poverty levels when we have an opportunity to try to raise them out of poverty by raising the minimum wage?
Small business in particular is opposed
Well,
to
small
this.
business, the ultimate question is who's paying for it? And small business feels very threatened by this because of their concerns about having to reduce the number of employees that they have. But surprising to me have been the number of calls from community-based providers, people who are providing services to the state who are very concerned because with the state's financial condition, they don't believe that and I agree, I don't see how they're going to get increases to cover the minimum wage increases in the community-based agencies. So they are very worried about it, and I think that we should be very careful before we enact a minimum wage.
The Senate, of course, earlier in the year approved a change in the way the state distributes its school aid formula to the poorer districts and the wealthier districts around the state. It's in the House. Of course, Representative Davis, you chair the Appropriations Committee for Elementary and Secondary. You heard testimony for and against the bill. Where do you think it stands now as far as the House goes?
Well, as far as the House goes, I mean, we're still considering it. I believe there's at least one amendment on the table, probably others, to try to deal with some of what we call the anomalies that exist in the bill. There are some districts that should otherwise benefit from the bill that are not benefiting from the bill. So we hope to make those kinds of changes, as well as strengthen the way that we count low income or poverty students. Strengthening that ability to count those students will have a significant impact on school districts in terms of turning them into winners where they may be losers right now.
It was originally a bipartisan bill in the Senate, but now there has been a groundswell of opposition in Republican ranks against the bill.
Well, they're big winners and losers. And I think that it's very controversial, certainly in my district. District 150 in Peoria would pick up almost $8.9 million, and the adjoining district would lose $3. So there are very good reasons why this bill should be vetted again and needs a lot more work to make it more fair. But the other fact about the bill is it shoves $200 million to the Chicago teachers' pension system, which many of our members find objectionable.
Representative Davis?
Well, I mean, when you have the bill is about not comparing apples and apples. And I think that's what people think, that all districts are the same. We have districts that are in different situations where a representative talked about one district gaining, one district losing. I think we need to look at, the differences in those districts and see if that explains why maybe one gains and one loses. As far as the Chicago teachers' pension, right now we are contributing significantly to downstate teachers. And I think, that was just an attempt to maybe try to balance that out a little bit.
Good parsing of the issues, gentlemen. I appreciate your time, as always, on Illinois Lawmakers. Up next on the program, we will get a Senate perspective on what's taking place here in the Illinois State House, or perhaps more importantly, what's not taking place right now. We continue on this edition of Illinois Lawmakers with a pair of veteran members of the Illinois Senate. They are Democratic Senator Don Harmon of Oak Park, who serves as Senate Pro Tem and chairs the Executive Assignments Committee. Senator Bill Brady of Bloomington is a Deputy Senate Republican leader and Republican spokesman on the Senate Insurance Committee. Good to have you back after the holiday break.
Thanks for having us.
As we look to where we are now in the veto session, there's kind of an air of hurry up and wait, because a lot of things are going to change down here on the second floor on January 12th when Bruce Rauner is inaugurated as governor. Is there kind of a wait and see attitude over on the other side of the Capitol here in the Senate?
I think to a great degree there's some routine business we need to finish up in the veto session. A few larger issues we're likely to tackle, but much of governing will wait for the new governor.
Senator Brady?
I agree. Pat Quinn was often quoted as saying, let the will of the people be the law of the land. And the will of the people right now is that Bruce Rauner govern. He's going to have to do so, though, in a bipartisan way. We all know that. And I think these issues, as we move our state forward, are better left to after the first of the year, with the new administration taking office, working in a bipartisan way to bring about meaningful change to our state.
He was just downstairs having a media opportunity, and he was talking about the budget deficit that we're looking at and the budget problems we're having. He said, well, we got into that in a bipartisan manner. We're going to have to get out of it in a bipartisan manner. Does that signal perhaps a bit of, I wouldn't say conciliatory, but yes, perhaps a little bit of a conciliatory attitude?
Well, I think it's a clear recognition of the reality of the situation. This is the first time we've had divided government in more than a decade, and divided government has its virtues and its vulnerabilities. I don't think we'll be able to do some of the dramatic progressive things we were able to do with Democratic leadership, marriage equality, abolition of the death penalty, things like that. But we should be able to deal with the nuts and bolts of government in a real bipartisan fashion. For the last 12 years, we've passed Democratic budgets with Democratic revenue streams, and now the Republicans and the governor in particular are going to own the state budget and have to participate.
And participate may mean Republican votes on very difficult bills, Senator Brady, like budget bills.
You're absolutely right, and Senator Harmon's absolutely right. The Democrats have had control for the last dozen years, and now I'd like to think that, though not as divided, but a bipartisan government that can be united, and more united than what we were in the past, to make some very tough decisions. There's no question Pat Quinn has left us with record deficits and debt, poor job performance, and a whole host of issues, which is why we need a jobs package, we need a tax package, we need a deficit reduction package. But that's going to have to be achieved in a bipartisan, I hope, uniting way.
Democrats still hold supermajorities in both the House and Senate. The Republicans picked up one seat over in the Senate, but that's still a large supermajority for the Democrats there. So it comes back down to Senate President John Cullerton and House Speaker Mike Madigan. How do you think those gentlemen are going to work with the new Republican administration?
I expect they'll be very cooperative on things where we can be cooperative. We all want Illinois to succeed, and I think we'd want to give the governor the tools to do the difficult things that need to be done. There are other things where I think a new governor should gird for a fight if he comes after principles important to working families across the state.
Senator Brady, we're at a situation right now where in a few days the temporary income tax rate of 5% will go back down to 3.75%, opening up a budget deficit in this current fiscal year of at least $2 billion. And that's going to double next year in 2016 if nothing's done.
No question about it. And this is where the rubber meets the road. I mean, why is tax policy important? Well, frankly, Pat Quinn raised the taxes 4 years ago. He promised to pay down the debt. He didn't. It didn't help our job economy. We need a tax package that will foster encouraging job growth and paying down the debt. There's no question, though, that he's left us with a huge cliff by spending money this year knowing it's going to fall off without a solution. We have to deal with that. The important thing here is that I think we put the state on a path of reducing an overburdensome income tax, both corporately and personally, and get us back down eventually over that 3% level in an affordable way. But what Pat Quinn has done by spending money in the first 6 months of this year has created a huge cliff that's going to have to be dealt with.
Let's talk more about what's going to happen after January 1. You don't have enough money to get through the current fiscal year, so the new governor has a huge problem on his desk from day one.
But let's also be honest. I think Senator Brady is being unnecessarily harsh to Governor Quinn. We enacted a temporary tax increase, and we used that money to fully fund our pensions for the first time in generations. We paid down a huge chunk of unpaid bills. We went from a high of $10 billion to about $4 billion. That's $6 billion in unpaid bills we caught up on. The fact is, with that tax rate expiring, we are in a very difficult spot. I have no idea where Governor Rauner proposes to get the revenue necessary to fund the services people expect.
Well, Governor Quinn, though, spent money. He did not reduce the unpaid bills, according to the Comptroller's office, and that he promised to do. So there's no question that Governor Rauner, Democrats and Republicans, are going to have to come up with a budget that doesn't cripple state government, doesn't balance the budget on the backs of the hardworking families, but that moves our state progressively into a better tax policy so businesses can grow. We're going to have to, because of what Governor Quinn did, and make no mistake about it, he spent money like we'd have all the tax revenue for the entire year. We're not going to have that. Some difficult decisions are going to have to be made both on the revenue and the spending side, and I believe in a bipartisan way.
We're starting to see some inklings of what this budget might look like. At least there's some exercises going. Let's be fair. There's some exercises going on right now. The Illinois Board of Higher Education had a meeting with the governor's transition team, and they said you may be looking at a 20% cut in fiscal year 2016. You may have to hold back another 10% of the fiscal 2015 budget. You have a major university in your district back in the Bloomington area, Illinois State University. Sure. That's going to cause some consternation amongst university administrators as they try to get their heads around a 30% cut in the next year.
But realistically, Republicans and Democrat governors alike have always come in and said, what would the picture look like if you had to cut this and this and this? The Rauner team is just doing what they simply should do, is due diligence to uncover the truth about what the effects would have so that we don't put forward a budget that cripples hardworking families, students, and others. So examining what the options are is a very important process, a part of governing correctly.
One thing I've heard is that we're not really talking about going back to the temporary income tax increase rate that expires on January 1. We're starting with a clean sheet of paper. Senator Harmon, what might be some of the things the Senate Democrats would like to put on the table in terms of, say, revenues, revenue enhancements, and what you might be able to concede on the business growth side of the ledger?
Well, I've long been an advocate of the fair tax, a constitutional amendment that would allow us, like most other states that impose an income tax, to apply lower rates to lower income levels and higher rates to higher income levels. That came close to passage in the spring, but given the political environment, came up just a little bit short. I think we could revisit that. I think that would be a fair way to level the playing field and not balance the budget on the backs of the hardworking families of Illinois. Beyond that, I think we are looking for Governor Rauner's leadership. I don't envy the task he has. He's campaigned on a pledge to lower taxes and increase spending, and as we indicated with the budget deficit that's coming, it's going to be awfully difficult to do.
Would the Republicans be willing to put some votes on a negotiated tax increase bill?
Well, I think what we're talking about is Republicans are supporting reducing the tax from where it is today. It automatically falls off. Can we let it fall off entirely because of the spending impact plan? That's really questionable, and that's the exercise the Rauner administration is going through. I think it's important to note, though, what is called the fair tax is nothing but a graduated income tax that would, I think, cripple Illinois' economy. But realize this, we already give tax breaks to some of the lowest earning hardworking families through deductions and earned income tax credits. So we already have that kind of a system. So I think what we've got to look at is how can we reduce the current tax structure and burden on hardworking families and grow our economy.
He's also talking, Governor-elect Rauner is also talking about expanding taxes to services.
He has. I think that there's another area that's more important to me, and that is that we begin collecting the sales taxes that are due the state of Illinois that are not collected right now. As we've seen, our sales tax base has eroded due to internet purchases. Yesterday, I think we had, Cyber Monday? And
You're
Christmas
sounding more
presents.
like a Democrat there, Senator.
Well, no, this is about a tax that is due under law.
Right.
We just need to come up with a mechanism to collect it. It's also a tax that works at the disadvantage of people who employ people in Illinois who have bricks and mortar and pay property taxes. So I think the first area to look at bringing revenues into the state is collecting a tax that's already in place and due.
Yeah, I actually sponsored a bill, and now on your 1040, there's a line to report those taxes that are due. And the collections have gone up dramatically. There may still be money left to collect, but that's
lots of hard work ahead of you both.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your time, Senator Harmon, Senator Brady. Always good to see you both. That's it for this special edition of Illinois Lawmakers on the veto session of the Illinois General Assembly. From Springfield, happy holidays.